most faithfully communicate that. Just some of the other things that don't compute would be, issues of, hey, when I went to school, it was like this. Well, school, education, lifestyle things, those things don't make sense. Yeah, when I graduated from high school, or those kinds of, some of the kinds of things that don't necessarily, some of these guys may only have third, fourth, fifth grade education. Their life is lived day to day. They do, many of them don't understand the idea of preparation and envisioning and preparing for the future. You live today to exist today.
Yeah.
And tomorrow you'll do the same thing all over again.
I think it's incredible to think of how careful, I don't know if careful is the right word, but just how particular you have to be when you're talking to, breaking your own habits in your head, talking to someone who's completely more diverse and, or just complete diversity of different cultures and things of that nature.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when we went to Brazil, one of the things that I did not recognize and understand was here we're very equal from an equality, the same way the Gentiles were looked down by the Jews. Those differences in culture in Brazil, they looked down on the agrarian society, they looked down on the Indians, the city people did. So there's a lot of continuity between the way they did that. I bet it's getting close to that in the cities, between the cities and the agrarian side. But there's a lot more that we just assume equality across the board. No, it's not. I mean, their slavery mentality, they probably have a better idea about it than we would at this point.
Well, like in Africa, you have tribal,
Right.
and tribal war or tribal conflict is a very real thing. Like a lot of the conflict that happens in Africa is intertribal, and so it has nothing to do with place in society or life or socioeconomic or anything like that. It has everything to do with the tribe.
Not so much political.
Yeah. You have issues in that regard. I think one of the other things that we struggle with is that majority of the world is communal in the way they live, and we're very individualistic. In majority parts of the world, what you have is the family units living all very close together and relying upon each other to survive. In parts of West Africa, you'll find compounds, and the whole compound is all relatives. Sons marry a wife, and they bring them into the compound, and then you have 3, 4, 5 generations of people who are all living right there together. I say 3, 4, 5, 2 or 3 generations living all right there together. They're all dependent upon each other. Now that's in the rural part. In the city, in the more urban places, it's a little more typical to our Western society, but there's still the communal aspect of it. You're still relying upon family, even if you're not in communal connection together. That's something that we don't really have here. As far as we talk about it. If we think about local church being a community of believers together, but putting that into practice in reality is a challenge. That's something that they have a very strong ability to do. So it's just some of those kinds of things that are that create some of the challenges in cross-cultural communication. So the historical cultural context. Understand the situation in which the author composed the literature and any historical cultural details the author mentions or assumes. Now, there's some appendices in the back of this. Are they in there? Corey, do y'all have those appendices? I might have added them later. Addressed them.
There.
Okay. There's a handout back there that kind of gets to some of this. The Bible comes to us secondhand through others who lived at different times and different places. The correct interpretation of a biblical passage will be consistent with the historical cultural background of the passage. So, all that to simply say, it wasn't written to us, like I mentioned earlier. And so we have to try to put ourselves in the historical cultural context of the writer to the audience. This is the art of discovering what it would have been like to be in first century Israel. The customs, the practices, the cultural ideas. We start talking about the temple. They go to the Temple Mount. Why? Why would they have regularly gone to the temple? What was when Jesus addresses in Matthew 6 the issues of giving, praying, and fasting, why does he do that in Matthew 6? That's Jewish worship. They prayed regularly, they gave, and they fasted. When you start reading about fasting, they fasted twice a week. And the pious Jews made sure everybody knew that was a day of fasting. It was the way they looked, the way they dressed, their whole appearance was very evident. Oh, today's a day of fasting, right? And what Jesus addresses there is saying, hey, when you fast, don't put on the gloomy face. He says, make it look like every other day. It's to be done in the secret place of your heart before the Lord, because it's an individual aspect of how you're living out your life. Not to be publicly done in front of others. When you give, do it as such that your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing. Well, that's hyperbolic because you can't really do that. So, but it's saying do it in a way that you're not looking for man's glory, or you're not looking for approval from others. Understanding why Jesus is communicating those types of things to that audience is part of the historical cultural context. He's not just arbitrarily talking about praying, giving, and fasting. It's because that was the central components to Jewish worship. Understanding the temple and temple worship. Understanding the feasts that the Jews had. Understanding the caravan of the people of Israel. A couple million people leaving Egypt in the Exodus, and why it's so significant. To be wandering around in this wilderness, and to have to feed and water 2 million people plus animals, and they're complaining and arguing. It's trying to put yourself into that situation and saying, okay, that's part of the historical cultural context that we're trying to develop. That we want them to sort of begin to understand before they bring it over. So it's an art of discovering these things. And I think it's best to seek this information while maintaining clarity of the meaning of the author. So I see this attempt to think that the historical cultural background and the sufficiency of Scripture might be seen as mutually exclusive. But I don't think that's the case. Knowing the background enlightens and makes sense of what one is reading. Okay? So here's a couple of examples. 1 Corinthians 11. I'm trying to read that. 1 Corinthians 11. 2 through 16. So here's what it says. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firm to the traditions, just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man. The man is the head of the woman. And God is the head of Christ. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is in the image of the glory of God. But every woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed, man is not created for woman's sake, but woman for man's sake. Therefore, woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as a woman originates from man, so also man has his birth through the woman. All things originate from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that a man has long hair is a dishonor to him, but if a woman has long hair, it is glory to her. For her hair is given to her for a covering. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no practice, nor have the churches of God. Okay, wow. Yeah. So, historical cultural background. How could that be, to understand the historical cultural background, how could that be detrimental to understanding or interpreting what Paul is talking about here? Or how is knowing the background enlighten us to what we're reading, I guess is a better way to put it.
Obviously, if you're reading it without any cultural context, then you just assume, oh, if a guy's got long hair, he's dishonoring. A woman doesn't have long hair and she's not covering her head when she prays to God, there needs to be a very incorrect view of reading it. But knowing the context, you know that the church at that time was having issues with gender identity, and so that's what Paul is addressing.
Yeah. So the broader understanding of what's happening in Corinth helps you to understand this particular passage. You know, if you extract this out of the bigger picture of the first letter that Paul writing to Corinth, now you can have misinterpreted what's being communicated here. So, you know, that's a clear way, I think, that you have to be able to understand, or at least dig into the historical and cultural background in order to be proper interpretation. You know, that's just a couple examples. Can you think of another one? The one in Revelation was another one I gave you 13. Can you think of another passage where if you don't know historical cultural context, you can be misguided in your interpretation, your understanding of what's being done? Huh?
Old book of Philemon.
Okay, good. The issue of
Matthew
slavery.
7:1.
Okay. What else?
It's 4:13.
Yeah. I mean, even simple things where Paul talks about greet everyone with a holy kiss.
Oh yeah.
I mean, so does that mean I'm supposed to kiss everyone? I mean, you know what I'm saying? If you're not careful,
Cultures do.
huh?
They do greet with kisses. A lot of cultures greet.
Yes, yes.
Did
If
you not get your
it's
kiss
in a
from
culturally appropriate setting, like it was then, that's what you do.
Well, they did it in Mexico.
Yeah.
So there's cultural things that you begin to recognize, you know, and that this crosses even just for general things that you do today when cross cultures. For example, West Africa, you don't shake with the left hand. You know why? That's your poop wiping hand. That's you just don't shake with the left hand.
Oh, that X's out. Hugs.
In some cultures, you don't call somebody to yourself like this. That's offensive. You do it this way. You don't do it with one finger. That's offensive. Like, so we all have some of those. What are some of the cultural faux pas that we have that you would say, you know, if somebody comes and does something, somebody get offended or
Little finger.
okay, middle finger, yeah, California love. What else? Beverly Hillbillies, man.
Yeah.
Do you think any other just sort of cultural
Spitting in public,
spitting in public? Okay, good.
which that's actually very common in some of the cultures.
Yeah.
TV.
What else? Put you on the spot.
I mean, there's a lot of drinking and smoking differences culturally, especially here in the South compared to North and culture up north here in Europe.
I'd say even use of certain language.
Yeah.
When I lived in Ghana, or when I lived in Burkina Faso, we had a guy that lived close with us. He was sort of our translator and was teaching us the language. He was from Ghana, so in Ghana they, British English, and he used certain words appropriately. I mean, by dictionary form in an appropriate way, and I was like, "Bring it on." What did you say? Oh, brother, what is wrong? And so words that were considered foul, when used correctly, were not wrong, were not offensive in his culture, in his language. And I mean, he did it a second time, and the second time it was a little more like, what did you say? And so, man, he meant no disrespect. It wasn't used in vulgarity. So, I mean, these are some of the cultural things Men holding hands. Not offensive in West African culture. I
Wearing
really
a hat
had
in
to,
the sanctuary.
huh?
Wearing a hat in the sanctuary.
Okay, so we have some things here that we would consider that are cultural, that aren't necessarily, So you have this issue of interpreting where you go, okay, I have to know cultural, historical customs and practices, at least be familiar with the need to know, so that way I come and go, man, this is strange. What is Paul talking about here? And that's where this particular concept of historical cultural context becomes very important in good interpretation. 3 reasons why this principle is important. This comes from Klein and Hubbard and Blomberg. Number 1 is perspective. The circumstances in which communication occurs substantially affect, if not determine, the meaning. We need to know the original communication of the initiator and receptor. Number 2, mindset. This describes the mental attitude or inclination. Speech acts communicate content in certain ways, for specific purposes, for certain intended emotional impact. I think about reading the book of James, where he talks about some of the imagery he uses. That's important. He uses that imagery intentionally, where he's talking about the tongue, and comparing it to like the rudder of a large ship. Something very small can impact something very big. And so knowing some of those things helps us. What's he trying to communicate? And then the third reason is contextualization is the very heart of interpretation. And while the first 2 are focused on the original recipients, contextualization focuses on expressing the message accurately in a more current context. We look back to the original, and we look to the foreground of today. So just basically trying to draw a concept for them that understanding this is important to good interpretation because of perspective, the mindset, and contextualization. Now, a word like contextualization might be a word that we have to probably unpack for them. What does it mean? What does contextualization mean? So one of the other dangers that we can have is using words that we take for granted as far as theological words that may not compute. Now, I don't think you can. There's not a dumbed down version of contextualization.
Right.
So you have to explain what that is so they can understand. Now, there's a better way to describe propitiation without using the word propitiation. Contextualization is not something that you can steer away from. I think you just have to go get the headlong and then describe it. So and that's some of the things we'll figure out as we move along. Some of the things that maybe create a little bit of confusion. And this is again where James becomes very helpful. And and he said to me before, hey, I think they're struggling to understand this, or I think we need to clarify this or something. And at times, because we've trained with him and he's familiar with what we're wanting to communicate and what's being done, that and I trust him wholeheartedly, that at times I've let him sort of take a discourse and explain something, and then let him share with me what he said in an effort to explain something that was slightly unclear. Again, that's why it's important for those guys to be with us. Not just some random translator that we picked up on the side of the road who can speak English and French, and we go into a situation where they have no training, no preparation. He'll be fully prepared when we get there. So that's helpful. And I've been in those situations. I've been with translators who did not have preparation, training, equipping of any kind. They're just. And I've had translators that were unbelievers. But it's because, and I'm not with our organization, with different times. But they were the only people that knew both languages, so you're stuck. And that's why we've taken the time to get to know, vet our regional coordinators, and trust them explicitly. So, So principles for historical cultural background. We must understand each passage consistent within that background. Determine the impact of the passage that it had on the original setting. So what does it matter that that passage in that setting was being delivered? We must express biblical truth in our language, which most closely corresponds to the idea of the biblical culture. We do not allow features of historical cultural background to sabotage the main task in understanding the text. So I can't make a text say something that it doesn't, nor can I avoid saying something that it does say. And so both of those are equally true. I can't take away something that it says. I can't, I could, I guess, but that's not faithful interpretation. Nor do I want to make it say something that it doesn't. And so, in other words, to understand the historical cultural context is going to help me to come to that conclusion of what it is and what it actually is saying. Again, there are 7 questions. We have talked about those already before. The last one, though, we unpack a little deeper here. We're talking about the background. 6 features to consider. It's the worldview of those that are involved, societal and economic structure that exists, the family patterns, marriages, statuses of towns, persons, physical features, climate, typography, political climate, behavioral patterns, dress and customs, religious practices, the rituals, the convictions. Again, these are just the things that we need to sort of try to gather from an original text, original audience. When Paul addresses issues of marriage in Ephesians 5, why? How did the church of Ephesus view marriage? Was there some issue of how they viewed marriage that prompted him to engage in that conversation or that part of his letter? And if so, what was it? As best we can understand, what was it? So those are the kinds of things that we have to try to think through. Sources to use to gather this. One is the scripture. We talk about using biblical dictionaries and things like that. And this is, again, where we're going to communicate. Here's what we need to do. Now we've got to think through how can we do that? How do we find the opportunity to do that? Whether we're looking for resources or asking them if there are such things as biblical dictionaries that we can find access to. And then Scripture, interpreting Scripture is a necessity to being faithful to historical cultural background.